What's up, Tweener heads? Welcome back to another Tweener head tennis video today here on our channel. And if you are new to the channel, hey, how's it going? My name's Phil, and this is where we get to talk about tennis in a more casual way for you guys to understand what's going on and off the court, and just have some fun with the sport of tennis itself. And today's more of an opinionated video in a way, but also trying to bring light to the situation. And it's a little bit late to talk about it, but after Hamburg, I really think we need to talk about tennis playing during a pandemic. And we've talked to a lot of people. We just posted our interview with Abigail Johnson, freelance commentator. We talked to her about commentating and participating in the tennis world during a global pandemic. I've talked to players about what they're doing during a global pandemic. Talked to Tara Moore about what it was like to play at a tournament during a global pandemic. And it makes sense what everyone's being said. And it's hard to understand why certain rules are different everywhere else, but it just depends on where you are in the world in terms of global rules, the amount of crowds you can have at certain events, the amount of players that are allowed to participate, the travel restrictions, everything that goes into these tournaments, and what all these everyday operations that go into a tennis tournament. But for me, at least, I wanted to bring this up in a more formal video because I'm bringing in a doctoral student in biomedical engineering, one of my best friends, to talk about the COVID-19 situation, the PCR test that players are using, and positive and negative tests, and what it all means, to kind of get you guys basic understanding of what these players are going through and what kind of tests are being taken and done for these players to actually participate in these events. The more rant and opinionated part of the video is this part where we're going to be talking about how Benoit Paire is still allowed to play tennis even though he's testing positive and testing negative, and flip-flopping between these results and why he's still allowed to play. It's hard to understand why a player is allowed to play when you test positive twice and then have a negative, and they allowed him to play in Hamburg. Look, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense that he was allowed and then still pulled out of his match in Hamburg. Why would you even allow him to play? Why would you even allow him to participate in that tournament? Because this all stems back from when he tested positive at the US Open and the bubble that they made inside the bubble with all the players that he came in contact with. Those original 7 to 11 players that came in contact with Benoit Paire after he withdrew from his match in the middle of his match during Cincinnati. He pulled out of the US Open and had to quarantine in New York after he tested positive for COVID, was allowed to travel to Rome, played Rome, whined about his situation, how he didn't get enough time to play on clay, and then he threw a fit during his first round match for Yonex because he was played on the first day instead of the second day, and he was pissed about that scheduling. But this man is allowed to travel in between countries that have different travel restrictions and different rules. If you're not an athlete, you're not allowed to travel from country to country willy-nilly sometimes. It depends on their travel restrictions, but these players are traveling back and forth to make a living. And what Abigail Johnson said in my last video is that some of these players have a privilege to actually be competing and still have a job during a pandemic. And I totally agree with that. But the fact that a player tests positive multiple times and then is still allowed to play, it doesn't make sense. So when Paire is still allowed to travel to France after he comes out during his press conference after he withdrew in Hamburg, and he tells everyone about the situation that he had with the doctors, and the doctors cleared him, and it frustrates me to see players putting others at risk, not just themselves, but others at risk, because Paire has made a very good living. He honestly has been a very entertaining player to watch, and there's nothing against Paire. We all know the character that he is. From a unity standpoint and making sure that everyone else is safe, it doesn't seem like he's grasping that concept. Because if he withdrew because of his illness, and I think that was the reason why he withdrew from Hamburg, then why wasn't Casper Ruud publicly tested? Why didn't his results become publicly tested? Why didn't more people that were involved during that match, why wasn't something said about that? We had to find out all this information during his press conference that he talked about openly too. And then he travels to Paris for the French Open, and he's seeded and he's still allowed to play. But Verdasco tested negative all the way through, and then tested at the French Open positive, wasn't allowed to get a retest, and then did 2 to 3 other tests afterwards that said he was negative. Which brings up another issue with cross-contamination of results. Because if his was a false positive from the PCR test that they're using, how many others are false negative? How many others are false positive? At the beginning of the tournament, I believe 2 to 3 were exposed, and they were not allowed to participate in the tournament. But the fact that Verdasco possibly had a false positive, it looks like he had a false positive after he came out with his statement saying that he got independent tests from other labs, it brings a lot of questions medically what's going on. And that's why I wanted to bring on Ali, and this is where we're going to talk about the PCR test, the cross-contamination that can happen when everyone's getting tested. A good example that we used was the NFL and how they had 50 to 60 false positive cases. And I just wanted to let you guys see this part of the video, and I wanted to bring Ali on because he walks us through what a PCR test and shows us and talks about what these tests are all about and how false positives and false negatives are very likely during big examinations. So now let's get to the Ali part of this video. I hope you guys did enjoy this video. Make sure to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button.
This is the part of the video where I brought my friend on, Ali, who has a biomedical background, to talk about COVID-19 and traveling and everything that has to go on, just to get a more scientific and more factual-based opinion on what these tennis players are exposing themselves to. Because while some people are still taking it willy-nilly, my frustration in this video is the fact that players that have tested positive, there are different rules amongst tournaments. Like we saw that in Cincinnati, we saw that at the U.S. Open with the 11, Landanovic at the U.S. Open, and now Verdasco with him then doing 2 negative tests after he was tested positive, and he was automatically defaulted from the French Open. Now, I personally am struggling because the dog is biting me, so that's fun. But the other thing that I wanted to talk to Ali with, and the first question I have is, and he's a big proponent on me not traveling. That's why I haven't been able to travel and get content, because every time I call him to talk to him about it, he says, what do you say?
Don't travel anywhere. There's a pandemic.
Yes. So tell us, because one thing I mentioned in my video is the PCR test. Walk us through what the PCR test is.
Yeah, sure. So PCR is a technique that's used in the lab quite a bit. Mm-hmm. PCR stands for a fancy thing called polymerase chain reaction. Mm-hmm. And essentially all it does is it makes copies of either DNA or RNA. So it's something that you use in the lab. So let's say you have a small amount of DNA. Mm-hmm. You use PCR to get more of it. So the way the PCR tests work for like COVID testing is you either get a nasal swab, which looks uncomfortable, or
it's super uncomfortable. I did it again this week. I spit blood.
Good. Get tested every week if you can. Or it's a saliva test, and all you're doing there is you're trying to see if you have the virus in your saliva or in your swab. And the way you're testing it is by breaking down whatever material you have in there, which is your own DNA, your own cells, but it could also be the virus. And it's the viral DNA. So all viruses have either DNA or RNA or some sort of nucleic acids that can be inserted into your own cells. And so what you're doing is testing to see if that RNA or DNA or nucleic acids that are in the virus is present in your own sample. And that'll tell you if you're positive or negative. So PCR is a really commonly used technique, and what's nice about it is that it does read very specific DNA sequences, so it can differentiate between your own DNA or your own RNA versus the viral nucleic acids. But the problem is it does have false negatives, or it does have false positives, and there's risk of contamination. And that's something that's happened in the NFL, where they have many players test positive. They find out then that the labs were actually contaminating the samples on accident. So there are still lots of kinks to work out with testing, and it's not 100% perfect.
So, and that's one of the things that I brought up to you when I was pitching the idea to you to come on the channel was the NFL was a perfect example where they had 50 to 60 cases of false positives, which threw everyone for a loop, because then everything became not eradicated, but it just became a lot of confusion for everyone, not just the NFL, but the media and everyone else that was participating, especially their families that were being now involved with them sacrificing their own lives to go play a sport that they love. And that's what tennis is doing today. With Verdasco, him traveling and getting a test before he arrived in Paris, testing negative, getting the positive, and then being defaulted from the French Open, and the tournament refusing to retest him immediately after he got his positive test back. Because in his letter, he says he did, I believe, 2 or 3 tests afterwards, and they all came back negative. From my perspective, what does that tell you, Ali?
So I think the first thing you have to think about when you do test positive is the quote unquote, there's a term in science, there's a term in statistics called positive predictive value, is how many of your positive cases are actually really positive. So the unfortunate part is that because COVID-19 or the coronavirus is not as prevalent, it has a low percent that it affects, and low relative to large numbers. It affects 2 to 3, I believe 2 to 4% of the population, or has affected them. Your positive predictive value is low because you can't always tell if you're positive or not. So I think the player, what they did in going and getting other tests from different labs, I think is a great way to go about actually seeing if they are positive or not. I think if you do get tested positively, you have to go back and take check in on yourself, validate the lab that did your tests, do a couple extra tests, and that'll be able to kind of tell you whether or not you're a little bit, if you're truly positive or not. So I think it is a little crazy that if he tested positive before, got tested negative before, tested positive, and then did 2 tests on his own immediately afterwards that came out negative, I think they should at least look into, if this person is truly positive or not. So I think it is a little ridiculous that they did not look into that further, like they did in the NFL, for instance.
So do you think that their lab is contaminated, or a lot of the results that they got back negative could be positives, or it doesn't work like that?
So you never know. You never know. The lab could be contaminated. If I'm working with different samples, there's a chance that I may have mixed a sample or 2 and it could have been someone else's. So there's always a chance of that. And that's what happened in the NFL scenario. There is also a chance where as you're amplifying your DNA or your RNA, your nucleic acids for the PCR test, you can read the noise of that amplification that PCR does as signal. So you can potentially read a positive case when there is nothing there, simply because of the noise level that you have in your amplification process. So I think, as the player did, and getting a couple extra tests, you should do that. You should retest and to ensure that you are positive. So something that the university I work at does is you do weekly testing, and these samples are pooled. And if something comes out positive, you test again immediately before they undergo. Yeah. So if they do say they recommend further testing. So when you get tested weekly, the recommendation is, we don't recommend you get tested again, or we recommend you get tested again. And the reason they do that is so that if they do indicate a positive case, they can, try to make sure of it by testing it twice.
So do you think, I'm looking at it from a tennis perspective, all these players going from tournament to tournament, how exactly could they do, from what I've seen in their tennis bubbles, is they fly to a tournament, they take the test, they wait 24 hours after they get their negative result or positive negative result, and then they're allowed to participate in whatever they have. That seems to be the logic here. And from what I've been trying to get through in this video is, how often do you think players should be tested in tennis compared to other sports? So
I know the NFL tests every day except for game day. And I think, every day if possible. If the tennis community has enough funds and resources to be able to test all these players every day, I would say everyday testing would be optimal. Because let's say you do get tested negative and it is a false negative and you actually have it, you hope that the next day you'll be able to catch it in your test. So I would say testing as often as possible. So again, my university, they want us to test every week if we can. So as much as possible, I think is optimal, because you never know. I can get tested on a Monday, and as I'm waiting for my results, I can go out. I'm driving home. I can touch something. I can talk to someone, and I can actually catch the virus. And then my result comes out as negative. But in that time between the result coming out and then the test, I could have gotten it. Mm-hmm. So I would say testing as much as possible is very, very important. And I think it's a little crazy that they didn't allow this player to retest, to officially retest. And this player had to go out on his own to retest. I think testing often and, often as possible is really important.
And for me, it seems like this player, Benoit Paire, that this whole video has been made a part of, that when he got into Hamburg, and there's different rules and regulations amongst each country, and the US is very different than Europe right now, because Europe had its fall, but now it's on the rise again. Mm-hmm. But for the guy that tested positive twice and then negative, and then was allowed to play his match and still defaulted at 4-1 against Casper Ruud, you're telling me that he still could possibly be carrying the virus and being allowed to play, and no one's questioning it?
That's a huge possibility. Yeah, that's a huge possibility. If you test positive once, that's already a huge possibility. If you test positive twice, these PCR tests have a larger false negative rate than a false positive rate. So the fact that he tested positive twice, yes, the fact that he tested positive twice, is a red flag. So it should have been, further explored. They should have at least done validation on the labs. And I'm wondering, in these tennis bubbles, not bubbles, I guess, because they don't create these bubbles, but are they sending it to, are these samples getting tested in labs that are validated by the tournaments themselves, or are they kind of just whatever's in the area? Do you know?
From my personal knowledge, the US Open, they had someone from the New York Health Organization, not the World Health Organization, because that's a whole different story. Not Dr. Fauci, but the county. They followed the rules of the county. Okay. They had to bring someone in specifically after Benoit Paire tested positive, and the 11 people that were allowed, and one of the 11, Manarino, that played Zverev, they delayed 4 hours because he had to talk to health officials to make sure he was safe. So from my perspective, I don't know what the Roland Garros is going to do. I don't know what the French Open is going to do, because we don't know the labs. From my knowledge, I don't know the labs that are being used. I don't know if it's the French government that's getting involved or the Paris government that's getting involved. And the fact that the cases are rising in Paris and they're allowing fans into the venue is another scary thought that we have to think about.
Yeah, I agree. Don't get me started on that. Stay home if you can. Wear a mask. Get tested. Please stop the spread. Stop the spread.
I think for everyone, it's hard because, and I'll wrap up on this though, I think it's hard to do that for some people because people survive on paycheck to paycheck per week. A lot of players are using, and it's another problem with tennis, is that they don't get a defined salary a year. Most of their money is going back into the travel, back into their expenses, which is very difficult for them because, and my finger's bleeding. Wow. Okay. It's very difficult for them to constantly not be paid, especially if you're surviving on a lower level, like the Challenger Tour, surviving on the ITF Tour, because these guys are still passionate about playing the sport, but they don't have enough to kind of take a month off to recover from the virus, like Nishikori did, like Dimitrov did, like Koric did, where they have a ton of money saved because of their skill. A lot of these players are traveling from the US to Prague to play all these small tournaments that are necessary. So to do this during a global pandemic and not have a necessary bubble, it's kind of terrifying, but necessary for them.
Terrifies me.
It's necessary for them. For us, not necessarily. For them, it is, because their profession relies on them traveling, and that's what one thing that tennis is very difficult to do with. So
And there's no such thing as a professional fan that you have to go, it necessitates physically going,
true.
To the venue. So it is a little worrisome. And the only thing I could say is I hope we get this all under control, whatever it may be, however it may be.
Mm-hmm.
But, the more we interact, the more we go out, the more we do things not socially distant, not wearing a mask, the longer this is going to continue. So hopefully this can all wrap up soon.
Yeah,
Fingers
hopefully.
crossed.
So I want to thank Ali for coming on to the channel today, and I would love to shout out his merch that he's wearing that you can support the channel with. You can order your Tweener
Head tennis shirt.
Yeah, Tweener Head tennis shirts at tweenerheadtennis.com/shop. So if you want to go support the channel in any other way by other than subscribing, make sure to go check it out by clicking the link in the description. So Ali, thank you again for joining us, and I really appreciate you guys listening to this video. Make sure you are subscribed, hit the like button, and I hope to see you guys soon. Thanks, guys.
Like, comment, subscribe.
Yes.
Intro and outro.